Hey folks, One Short Eye here. As you might imagine, there were many details about Conquests of the Longbow that I didn't talk about in my big video that just came out, so here are a number of those in no particular order. In the game, there are sandstone caves behind the old trip to Jerusalem. This isn't too far off from the real sandstone cliffs in Nottingham. I'm going to quote directly from Snowy, who posted this image on the King's Quest speedrunning Discord. Here is what the caves behind the real old trip to Jerusalem Inn look like. You can see how far they stretch into the background. In fact, the whole of Nottingham town center is full of caves like this, usually forming basements and cellars of houses, and some interconnect. Many go back to Saxon times. I mentioned a lot of inaccessible dialogue with the prior in my video, but that's also true of a lot of the characters. For instance, there are only 2 times that you can show items in your inventory to Much. On day 2 if you blow your horn after killing the Fens monk, and if you do the Fens on day 5, Much will be at camp on the morning of day 6. That means that many, or even most, of these responses are not possible to see. Like, if you give the cask to him, he would give it to his father, which is not possible in the game. Or he asks if he can give the false jewels to his sisters when we're done with them, which happens on day 9, and we can't talk to him on day 9. Funnily enough, he's the only core outlaw out of the 5 who will actually accept money if you give it to him. The rest of them say something like, "No, I don't need it, you put it to better use." As another example, the puzzle box disappears after you open it. But if you could keep it, you could also give it to the widow. Something that is possible in the game is that you can give her Folk's verses if you already opened the puzzle box and have the fire ring. But despite what Robin says, the verses don't actually disappear from your inventory, so you can just give them to her over and over. What I showed in my video on day 5 when you rescue the boys is sort of the optimal way to do it in terms of how you listen to the guards that are watching over them. Normally what you do is that you listen to them, they go off to try to get some money. While they're gone, you put money on the table and then leave. But there's some extra dialogue that I didn't show if you kind of mess that up at first, in a small way. So what will happen is that they'll go off to try to get some money, you walk in the room, and then instead of putting money on the table, you walk back out. At that point, the sheriff's men come back in, and now they talk about visiting another character named Will the Weasel to try to get money from him. So they go off again, and now you have a second opportunity to put money on the table. If you mess this up and then don't put money on the table this time, you're out of luck and you have to go the alternate route with not rescuing the boys via subterfuge and do the whole frontal attack stuff. But it's interesting that they do give you this second opportunity here. And what's also interesting is that the same dialogue plays after this, complaining that they ended up giving money to him instead of the other way around. So this him that they're talking about is either Will the Weasel or Jack, depending on how you did it, and it just doesn't really matter. It just uses pronouns anyway. You can talk to the babbling brook at the widow's cottage. If you do that, you'll get this variation on the infamous Dan Quayle quote.
And you take the UNCF motto that what a waste it is to lose one's mind or not to have a mind is being very wasteful. How true that is.
So after you get the fire ring, you can put it on and then put your hand on the fire in your cave, and Robin sort of tests out whether it will hurt him or not and finds out that no, in fact it doesn't, and you get this unique animation here, which is kind of cool. In the video, I talked about all the unique dialogue that happens if you go into town on day 9 with your beard colored one way, and then leave and come back with it colored a different way. And one that I didn't show in the video was that of Lob the Cobbler. He actually has a bunch of responses depending on what you do, but one of my favorites is that he sort of comments that your disguise is now less safe if you do it one way versus another. If you choose the frontal assault route to rescue the boys on day 5, the priority level, kind of the Z index, on this chain in the front isn't set correctly. So even though Robin's supposed to be running in front of it, he actually goes behind it when he crosses over it. If you use the look icon on the forest, you would expect it to just give the same sort of generic response every day, like, this is the forest, right? But actually, the generic response that you get changes every single day. For example, Robin mentions being uneasy on the days that the sheriff's men are, going through the forest trying to find him. In any case, each day does have a unique message when you look at the trees. I explained in the video how you can get the fire ring early and then put it on inside the Fens Monastery. If you walk up here to this corner in the docks and put it on there, there's something about the pathfinding, I guess, that's a little wonky, because then this Fens monk who comes in to kill you will do sort of a backwards moonwalk in. If you dress up as Puck, the yeoman on day 9 to fool the sheriff, you can bribe your way in and then just talk to the sheriff. But another way to handle that conversation is to give him 3 pennies, or at least 3 pennies, it doesn't really matter. And then you get this unique dialogue where you sort of bet the sheriff that you will take 700 marks from him, which you actually do. So you don't actually lose the coin by using it on him, but it's just sort of another way into the conversation. On the same day, if you go the jeweler route, one thing that was just found recently by AT Machine is that you can run out of rouge. So if you keep using it on yourself, Robin says that, yeah, I'm putting more and more on. And after 4 applications, he runs out and then throws the container away. So technically, you could lock yourself out of the jeweler's pathway if you were in a situation where you needed to have the rouge on. So that means having won the archery tournament the day before. And then you use all the rouge and then change out of that costume and back into it so that your beard's yellow again. So kind of an obscure one, but interesting. Early images show the player starting with 22 outlaws instead of 31. But if you lost as many outlaws as possible under 1.0 rules, you'd only have 4 left over at the end, which wouldn't make any sense because at the very least, the 5 merry men are still alive. So maybe when they changed the initial outlaw count, that's when they added this -9 stuff. As just a minor bit of something interesting, Tuck says "Merry Day, Sir Sheriff" on day 9 when you are trying to fool him, but he only will say that if you go the jeweler's path, but not the Puck path. Speaking of dialogue differences, there's a pretty big one when you meet the prior. So if you do the Fens Monastery first, then you'll get a little bit of banter between him and Robin, asking him about why he joined and all that, and then the prior will take off. But if you do the monastery second, the Fens Monastery second, and you rescue the boys the first day, there's this really long set of dialogue about the boys' rescue. Robin saying something along the lines of how, Robin Hood would obviously fall at your feet when if he happened to be here, Your Excellency, or something, just kind of mocking him. It's a pretty long conversation, too. But one thing that I didn't talk about with the scholars on day 8 at the fair is that obviously you're supposed to talk with them, but you can also talk with them at certain places over the fence. Like if you're on one side of the fence and they're on the other, not the whole length of the fence, but at certain points you can talk over it, which if you do it in the right or wrong way, I guess, results in some pretty funny glitches. Like here you can see that this is the false scholar, and he's sort of showing the book to the air. It also seems to screw up the pathfinding of the sheriff's men who are wandering around. This guy kind of floats up there, and then there's this glitch too that's kind of funny. But anyway, yeah, that can kind of glitch things out. So one thing that can happen is that if you're going through this forest chase sequence, and don't do the hand protection thing to turn into a tree, what you can do when the sheriff's men show up, if you talk to them and then use the insert key to switch to walk, you can actually get Robin to jump up when he's dead and run away from them even though he's been shot. So that's pretty interesting. He also found a way to duplicate the sheriff's men by going into the hand over and over again. I'll put links to both of these in the video description. I think that's pretty funny. I mentioned in the video how you can give the characters the amethyst at different points. One thing that I didn't mention was that you can give Folk amethyst, and apparently he really likes it, so that's kind of interesting. Also, something that's kind of weird with Folk is his scroll. Only in version 1.0, what can happen is if you spill the wine on the prior to make him leave, if you use the hand on the scroll at that point to get it, it's pretty straightforward. You just click on it, it's fine. But for whatever reason, if you leave the room and then go back in, the hitbox is different, and you have to put the hand like farther down. It's kind of weird, but they fixed that for version 1.1, it seems. Speaking of changes from 1.0 to 1.1, on day 9, you can go to the Cobbler Street, and if you use the hand icon on the closed door here, you'll get this message, which doesn't make any sense because it's mentioning the fair, and here we are the day after the fair. But they fixed this for 1.1, and they changed whether the window was open too to, I guess, make it consistent. We thought for the longest time that the only unique male scream in the game was this one from the Poacher. Because every other character, if you shoot them, whether it's Robin or whether it's one of the sheriff's men or the Fens monk, or the Fens monk who's attacking Marion, they all have the same scream, which, by the way, is King Graham's scream from King's Quest V, except it's shortened quite a bit. And so, we heard this Poacher scream. We thought it was different, but I actually figured out the other day that no, in fact, it's not different. It's just pitch shifted down. So it's the same exact scream. They lowered it by 3 semitones. Here's something that's just a little bit fun that most people wouldn't think to do. The pixie will run across the forest screen occasionally, pretty much throughout the entire game, but with some exceptions so that it doesn't interfere with other events happening. But you can try to use different items on it, and a lot of them don't do anything. But if you use the puzzle box on the pixie, Robin gets really annoyed for some reason. And he says, "There goes one of those bloody sprites. I cannot concentrate upon the puzzle box with such a distraction around." I don't know, just a little bit of funny dialogue that I wasn't aware of until recently. There's a little bit of unreachable dialogue with Folk when you're at the docks. So he's supposed to be able to say, "For a famous outlaw, you're rather indecisive." And it's supposed to trigger when the variable local 17 is true. But that variable never gets set anywhere, so it's inaccessible. And I think that it would have been triggered by something like Robin leaving the docks and then coming back, kind of a "what are you doing" sort of moment, but it just never got implemented. There's also this bit of dialogue with Folk that I didn't know about until recently. It only happens if you look at Folk when he's in the boat, and Robin will remark that Folk looks more scared than he was earlier. And Folk has this odd line about hating the water because it was foretold that he would die that way. I tried looking this up, and it might be a reference to something, but if it is, I can't figure it out. I was dealing with a beggar once and forgot my money in the cave. I thought that blowing my horn might initiate the same sequence with the men coming and then us exchanging the clothes, but you end up just annoying Will instead. Blowing the horn in the forest also summons Will, who again becomes increasingly annoyed the more you do it. In the monk spanking scene, there's a frame that appears to be unused. It sort of looks like sparks, but I think it's supposed to be sweat, maybe? If you watch the game carefully, you'll see that this only happens once, immediately after the transition from Watling Street, and at no point afterwards. So this seems like it's a bug. There's also this front view of the monk that's never used. Speaking of unused sprites, here's a few more of them. Here's Robin messing around with his bow. The Fens monk sitting down, which might have been intended to be used on this bench. We've got a back and front view of these two scholars, which are never used. Here's an interesting one of the widow summoning the golden net, apparently through some sort of magic. The tailor and the swineherd have full walk cycles, but in the final game they don't move at all. There's also this extra character in the campfire scenes, and a chicken. When you meet the false knight, if you shoot him immediately, he falls here. But if you go through the intended dialogue, he kind of falls backward instead. And when you search the knight, Robin behaves as if the knight's in the first position, so it kind of looks like Robin's randomly searching the ground. Speaking of this scene, once you enter the cutscene, you're not supposed to be able to move, but using the hand code unlocks the menu again. It's like they forgot to check which actions to re-enable or not. So once you have the walk icon back, you can moonwalk out of the scene, and if you come back, the knight is mysteriously already dead. I kind of like to imagine that the pixie came along and killed him. But if you do this in version 1.0, the knight isn't on the ground, it's John who's there just standing, and the game acts as if that's the false knight, which is kind of funny. I tried blowing my horn at this point to see if I could get a double John, like, the one who's supposed to be the dead knight and then another one who comes in, but the game wouldn't let me do that. On day 1, the soldier that we meet is named Jack. Regardless of whether you kill him, he's still alive later in the game. I suppose there could have been 2 soldiers named Jack, but I don't know. Speaking of, Jack and the other soldiers have a very different manner of speaking on day 9 if you wear one of the disguises while trying to escape. For example, we didn't commit no sacrilege, which sounds nothing like the Jack of day 1. On day 13, which is at the very end of the game, you have the option of going back to shore by asking the wisps to take you there. If you leave the screen and come back, the boat is gone, but the wisps still encourage you to get back in. You can reset this by leaving the fens entirely and then coming back. So it's not like it's a soft lock or anything, it's just sort of a funny bug. As I mentioned in the big video, there is no voice acting in Conquests of the Longbow, which is why I had a lot of friends help out with that. However, Sierra did release an unplayable demo of the game. It's sort of more like a trailer than what we would think of as a demo. Anyway, it does have voice acting, so let me play some of that.
Outwit and outfight your deadliest enemies as Robin Hood, boldest outlaw in all England.
A curse upon you and all the outlaws of Sherwood Forest. For every insult to my person, you'll pay tenfold.
Now, most people have responded very well to the community voice acting, though there have been a couple of people who have made comments about not liking it. Now, I know I can't please everyone, but in my defense, I just want to say I could have summarized every conversation. I could have voiced everything myself, but I think both of those would have been very boring. And frankly, I think what the community did is at least as good as what Sierra would have done. And in fact, I think, I didn't take the time to explain this in the video, but the level of what we did is kind of what Sierra would have done. They would have just pulled people from the office, from the programmer pool, from different departments to see who wanted to voice it, because they would not have paid Hollywood A-list talent to voice this back in the day. They would eventually go on to do that with things like King's Quest, but this was not a flagship series, so I think the voice acting that is in the video is kind of, it's almost an homage to how it would have happened had it happened back in the day. Anyway, that's all the details that I wanted to share for now. There are minor things here and there we could probably go into, but these were the main ones that I sort of thought about putting into the video at one point, but decided not to, probably for pacing reasons for the most part. Thank you for all your support, and I'll see you around. So I was on the Classic Gamers Guild podcast, which is a podcast that talks about adventure games with fellow Adventure Game Hotspot Network people, Anna and Paul. It was a lot of fun, and basically we talked about Conquests of the Longbow for, as it says here, 4.5 hours. I will put a link to this on this post, but what I wanted to show you here was that Anna posted this to Facebook, her Facebook page, and then Richard Aronson, the lead programmer of the game and also the voice of Cedric the Owl, but for these purposes, the part about Longbow is more important. He commented on it, and I wanted to preserve this history, read out his responses here because they're great. So at first he writes, "I am proud that I caught the dead ends in design before we programmed it. I got stock options for my work on Longbow, which for a bit made up for the huge salary cut we both took when we moved to Sierra. I did miss the private office I used to have." So that is something that I've read in a few sources, and especially talking to Sean Mills, that a lot of the Sierra employees did get stock in lieu of a lot of compensation. So there is that there. Anna asks if he remembers anything specific about programming in Longbow. He writes this: "I will only mention one bad thing. We had to start doing postmortems after games, and everyone got to chime in on how the game production went. Longbow got some criticism. I had several programmers added to my team as their games finished. I had no unassigned work to give them. We were deep in bug fixes. So for weeks they were at their desks checking bugs and getting paid overtime. The Mythical Man Month is required reading for a programming manager. It explains how adding new resources to a late project makes the project much later. One of them, an old-time Sierra Online lead programmer, was doing work on the side for Sierra Telephone. He was doing that while at work paid overtime for Longbow instead of fixing our last fatal bug. There was a way to gamble in Nine Men's Morris that broke the game. And Nine Men's Morris is that medieval board game with 9 different pieces on each side, and you move the pieces around, and if you get 3 in a row, you take your opponent's pieces, whatever. So talking about this fatal bug here. The bug was a common beginner's programming mistake. The code read that if you won less than 2 coins, something happened. Else, if you won more than 3 coins, something else happened. If you won exactly 3 coins, nothing happened. The proper coding should have been less than 3 coins, do the second thing. In programming, we call this often an off by 1 error. That was also inefficient code, as it required a second test when only one was needed. Once I learned the guy was not working for Sierra, I found the bug that evening. Then Richard Aronson writes, "Okay, 2 bad things. Old wounds still bother me." Aw. Another Sierra Online programmer, Carlos Escobar, was added when I had literally no work to give him. For 3 weeks, he got paid overtime to double-check other people's bug fixes. I neither needed him nor wanted him that late, but he was available. Perhaps he was being rewarded for good work on other projects. I think he came over when Leisure Suit Larry shipped. When we did our post-mortem, his comments were 100% critical of me because he thought he deserved to be the lead programmer. I thought I would get fired. Eventually, Carlos was fired for some other nastiness. I should mention the thing I took the most pride in. There had never been great-looking water in a Sierra game before. Or any game. About 5 months in, Ken Nishuye, I have no idea if I'm saying that correctly, Ken Nishuye and I started working on the key gorgeous image to really make Longbow stand out visually. That was Robin and Marion behind the waterfall. We created blue-toned animation loops for water, 64 base colors used in every palette that would render both Robin and Marion, and 196 shades of blue, including many that we translucent to faint. We then cycled those color palettes at different speeds as they fell in the waterfall. I learned a ton about the art side of Sierra from that, and in my opinion, it was a beautiful melding of art, programming, and music to give players a special moment that was definitely state-of-the-art game making. And that scene there is one of the more memorable ones in the game. Richard goes on here, he says, "I also came to Sierra Online with 10 years working at the big LA San Francisco Renaissance fairs. By the end, I had been cast in several plays, written 2, helped write a 3rd, and choreographed a 4th, as well as teaching workshops, acting multiple roles each fair, and had tons of in-character costume interaction all day long. So Christy let me do much of the incidental design for Nottingham Fair. I used all my programmers' names for various mongers at the fair to reward them for what had been a tough project. I did not include my name because to me that was bragging, and I knew there was resentment that an outsider with 10 years of line management experience at Fortune 100 companies had been hired as lead, so I didn't need to credit myself in any way and fuel that resentment. But Christy, and I think Bob Fishbach, who did a great job on that game, coded my character at the fair, Richard Aaron's son, who was hauling wood as that was much easier work than programming at Sierra. When I saw that in the shipped game, I was surprised and happy. But I have to say that fair scene is really cool, and whenever I get to it in casual plays, I love clicking on everything there. There's all sorts of little Easter eggs. It's just great.